Hi friends, Elizabeth here with Intentional. This December, your generosity goes even further. From December 1st to 31st, all donations to Intentional will be matched dollar for dollar up to $250,000 thanks to a few generous partners. Visit intentionalparents.org today or click on the link in the show notes to double your impact. And while you're at it, become a legacy builder. Together, let's strengthen families and in so doing, change the world.
You're listening to the Intentional Parents Podcast, brought to you by Intentional. Intentional is all about spiritual formation in the family. We desire to bring biblical hope and practical help. Enjoy this week's conversation. Welcome back to the Intentional Parents Podcast. We're here today. This episode today is brought to you by Phil Comer, specifically. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. That'll make sense in a minute.
That will make sense in a minute.
You can do that. I'll tell you why.
I'll tell him why. I will.
He's like, what?
Why is it brought to you by Phil?
An expert on this topic.
Yeah, Phil's the master of ceremonies. But thank you to everyone who's listening today. And thank you so much for everyone that's rated and subscribed. So appreciate that. If you haven't had a chance to just rate the podcast or even take a minute to just subscribe to it, it's such a helpful way to know when we release new content. You can do that on YouTube. Give a thumbs up there. Spotify, same thing. It means the world. And thank you to everybody that's taking time to do that. So please, if you haven't had a chance, leave us a comment. Let us know how you're experiencing this today. So why we're all laughing and why today's episode is brought to you by Phil Comer is because we're going to be talking about complaining today. And Phil is not alone because I think that a lot of people are in that space. But we do joke, and we're a healthy enough family where we can laugh about our strengths and our weaknesses. So Phil, thank you for sponsoring the episode today.
Sponsored by the guy who can feel entitled, selfish, and complaining and grumbling.
All of us can. I mean, all of us have it. But thanks for letting us laugh with you. Elizabeth is good at it too. She can know.
If so, the sins of the father were passed on to the daughter.
The generational sin in real time. Anyway, but we are going to talk about complaining today, and we're joking for sure. But obviously, complaining is a big deal, and to understand it, to understand where it comes from, what the Bible says about it, how do we actually interact with it? I think complaining is a really interesting thing, especially as a spouse and as a parent, because if your kids are like our kids, complaining is a part of life. It's a big part of life. So with that, Elizabeth's going to set up this episode. So give us some framework.
Yeah, well, I think we've just all been having good conversations around this topic with
borderline
some curiosity. Some borderline arguments around is complaining a sin, is it not?
Yes. Oh, wait, actually, truth be told, we were going to record this yesterday and there was too much tension. And I was like, I think we need to let this one simmer for a minute and think about this a little more. And everyone was great. So
is it a sin or is it not?
Yes,
and the answer is going to be in this podcast.
It was around the theology of is complaining a sin or not?
Yes.
And there were some differing opinions in the room.
This is good. Good.
But that's not going to be our primary focus today.
No.
What we really want to talk about is so often complaining is a symptom of something. And so we're going to talk about what that means and how do we get to the bottom of it. But the whole idea for this episode came out of a question that somebody asked me, just something she was pondering. She's been through immense suffering. She had a stillborn child. And years later is still processing. She'll be processing that the rest of her life. And she'd heard me talk quite a bit about lament and grief, which are like just subjects I'm so passionate about. And she'd said, I'm starting to just wonder, when does lamenting and grieving turn into complaining? Like, where do I need to be aware of where I'm not really lamenting with God, which we're going to talk about as well. And it's just turned into I'm griping and complaining about my life or about my circumstances, or you fill in the blank for whatever it is for you. And that was I've just sat with that question of like, it is very true that so often the things that we've been grieving about slowly over time can turn into we're grumbling and complaining at God about. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially the setup. That's what we're going to be talking about. So I think first we need to kind of like discuss and define like what is complaining? What does the Bible say about it? We'll get deep into the what's underneath it and lament and all of that. But I think that there's a lot of scriptures about complaining. Dad looks armed and ready. Tell us what they are, Dad.
Oh, well, you want to talk about grumbling right away?
Yeah.
Well, grumbling, it's nothing new.
Yeah.
Way back in the Old Testament, Moses, who was called of God, and he didn't want to do it. The Bible says he was the most humble man on the earth. That's in Numbers, it says about Moses. But he's called to lead God's people out of Israel, and they see the Red Sea part, and then they're, this miraculous. Can you imagine seeing that? And your kids watch the sea part, and you're delivered, and then the whole army that you're terrified of gets wiped out. And then it's not too much longer that they're griping and complaining. We missed the food in Egypt. It was spicier. And what did you lead us out of? There's no water. We're going to, So by the time you get to Exodus 16, it says the whole congregation grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And God's, still taking care of them. We should have just died. They're really whining and complaining. And God says, what he's going to do. But here's what verse 7 says. In the morning you'll see the glory of the Lord. He hears your grumblings against the Lord. What are we that you grumble against us? The Lord hears your grumblings, which you grumble against him. Your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord. And I think that's where, if complaining turns into grumbling, and in the New Testament, by the way, that word, the Greek word, sounds like grumbling. It's a murmuring. It's ganguzamos, the stuff you say on your lips. Why did that guy do that? I can't stand him. Like all the things that we will kind of grumble about. It's just raining again. It's like that's grumbling.
We're beginning to see a window into your life.
But when you get under it, I think sure, that's natural to complain about something we don't like. But when we start grumbling against the Lord because we don't like our life right now, or what, he's allowing to happen, or what I'm going through, we seem to be more quick to complain and blame than we are quick to thank God for the good things that we have even in the midst of those times.
Sure.
So anyway, that's one classic one. And then way in the New Testament, in Philippians 2, it says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. But right before that, it talks about God is at work in you, both to will and to work for God. God is working in us. What an amazing thing that the God who made the world, who sent his son to die for us, loves us so much that the Spirit of God is in us, and he's getting us ready to spend eternity with him. And out of this reverence for him, he's at work in him, and I'm to be a light to the world. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, of himself. And he said, you're the light of the world. So he said, you're different. You're, Peter calls us a peculiar people. We're strange people. We're here on this earth, but we know that our eternal home is with him forever. And so we're supposed to let this light shine. And so because God's at work in us, we're supposed to do all things without grumbling. So they're not going to see, I'm following Jesus, but, it's not that great of a life. It's pretty difficult, because look what's going on in my life right now. God is saying, no, that's not how we should be. And I know we're going to get into a little bit about suffering, because the Bible actually says in certain places that's part of our calling. Jesus said, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you. There's going to be times of mourning and lament and suffering. And out of that, we can comfort others because God's comforted us in those things. So it's all tied together. But for me, I think I land very clearly when my attitude is complaining against God and grumbling about my life right now. I think that is a sin because it's a lack of gratitude for what he's done for me. And he's always taken care of me. And when I start thinking about how he's always taken care of me and all the gifts he's given to me, my greatest one right here to my right, to my beautiful wife, who's put up with a lot of this grumbling way too much, has been dumped on her. I think it is a sin. And, sin is missing the mark. It's not the way God intends that I live. It's not the perspective he intends that I have. And so I think that it's easier for me to preach sermons about grumbling being a sin than to live it out. That's why Brook is saying this episode is brought to you by me. and I'll tell some stories when it's appropriate about some of the things that I have struggled with and still do struggle with. A sense of entitlement and all kinds of other things. So,
but that verse that we read the rest of the verse in Philippians 2.
Sure. Which part?
Because it talks about grumbling and disputing.
Yes.
And those are not really synonyms.
No.
When I looked them up, they're two different things, and it made me really convicted because I don't do much external grumbling. I'm not an external processor. It's all going on inside of me. So I think, man, I'm off the hook. I don't hardly ever do the external grumbling. But grumbling actually in the Greek is more of an external murmuring, muttering, complaining. And disputing, I discovered, is way more internal. It's inward doubting the goodness of God, basically. It's like an inward, maybe he's not so good. Everybody says that he will take care of you. Look at my situation. It's that inward. And then I got convicted. I think, oh gosh, I do plenty of that. When life is hard, it's just I don't spill it onto other people because it isn't just my natural way. So I think for both, what do they talk about? Sins of commission, things that you do. But then there's a bunch of us are more laid back or a little bit more inward, the sins of omission, the things I don't do that I know I ought to be doing. But there's still things where I'm missing the mark of the way of love that Jesus is talking about, that he wants us to live.
Well, complaining is, we were going to talk about this, but it's usually a symptom of something deeper. It's usually not just because the rain. I know for Phil grew up in the Bay. I mean, that's actually, we're poking fun at it, but I think that's actually a really good point is like you grew up in one, really set off to the side environment, this really rare environment that's never above 73 and never below 50 degrees. And then you come to a place like Portland, which is pretty aggressive in the arena of rain and dark clouds and a low ceiling of the sky doesn't seem to go
low
too
ceiling
high.
of depression all the time.
Just kind of hovering.
Well, it was called the most depressed city in the United States, wasn't it?
I'm sure at one
I
point
think it was. I think you're right.
People are doing
but I
light
mean, I
therapy.
guess that's an interesting, so like that is an external change, a pretty big one, weather affects us. But that was hard, like, as an example, it wasn't just that it was rainy. It was probably like a grief of some sort, right? Like,
Sure. So I lived in the Bay Area. The reason there's millions of people there, it wasn't like that when my parents moved there after World War II. It wasn't that crowded. It was just it's one of the few spots in the world that there's no humidity and it's a Mediterranean climate, and you're 25 minutes from the beach, 40 minutes from the city, all this stuff. And people were moving there. Businesses were local way before it became Silicon Valley. So you grow up there, and as a kid, you don't think anything of it. It's like
it's just your
normal.
life.
It's normal. Oh, let's go to the beach. You're there in 20 minutes. Okay, so and I lived in that environment. We lived literally a mile from the beach for 4 years. The rest of the time, that's where I grew up. Didn't really think anything of it. It's like you don't know what you have until it's gone, right? And then moved to Portland, and that was clearly led by God. But yes, I struggled with the rain and perspective. I'll never forget the first time we were trying to make friends. They go, "Hey, you want to go to the beach with us?" We go, "Yeah, we'll go to the beach." So we start driving from Portland to the beach. Well, I'm used to getting to the beach in 22 minutes. So we're finally we've been going like 35, 40 minutes, and the sign says, seaside, 60 miles. And I'm thinking like, oh, this takes, but I thought if I'd moved from Kansas
You'd be very
to
happy.
Portland, and people did. They moved from that or from, Syracuse, New York, where there's snow on the ground, you're shoveling snow half the year. Oh, this is paradise. And I'm saying, no, paradise was the Bay Area. This is like, it's all perspective.
Yep.
So my perspective was, and then when we got to the beach, it was freezing cold. People were wearing sweatshirts and flying kites. And I'm like, this is not what I'm used to. So my perspective was total entitlement. Like, it shouldn't have taken this long to get here. It's too freezing cold here. And this is not the beach. What a lousy attitude. Whereas if I flew from... One pastor I served under, he's from Wichita, Kansas, and he said the best view of Kansas I ever had was in my rearview mirror, which is a slam on Kansas. But what he was saying was just flat, farmland, no mountains. Now I'm in Portland, and there's mountains, and there's hiking, and there's water, and there's lakes, and he's like thrilled, and he still lives there. And I'm going like, well, you don't know what it's.
You don't know.
So that's so wrong. And so I got another verse that I thought of, and this is still a struggle in my life. So The joke now is we're living in Bend, and I've never lived in a place where it's really cold. You go to the snow. If you live in the Bay Area, you go up to the snow for a
Yeah, and then you
weekend
leave.
to play in the snow, and then you come back to 70 degrees.
Yes.
But when you live in Bend, it gets really
It's
cold.
yeah.
And so Diane said, if you start complaining about the cold, like you complained about the rain,
It hardly ever rains.
I'm going
here.
to kill you. No, what did you say? So now we created a system where
Fund.
they're going to find me.
Yes,
And
it's
we're gonna
called
put it-
Phil's.
It was
Phil's-
Scarlett who came up with it,
She
and
came
I
up with-
heartily endorsed it.
It has to hurt. So it's $20, not five. In my rock band days, if you had a bad attitude in the band, we fined you $5. Well, that was like at least $20 now.
Yeah.
Probably 50. And so,
If you complain, you
but
get
there's
charged.
no money in it yet because that was a motivator for me.
I heard you today.
We called
I
it.
won't say it, but I heard
It's called Phil's Funeral Fund.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So-
I know. I know.
So who has to hear the complaining? Who?
Well, we were
Is it
talking
just
about
in my
you. We were
presence?
talking about you. So
Okay.
if we expand it, I'm going to have to get a savings account. But let me read to you 1 Timothy 6, 6.
yeah.
Godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. So in other words, you say,
Yes.
I'm following Jesus and I'm a godly person, but I'm not happy with what's going on in my life right now. Well,
Yes.
you're not exactly going to be a
Yes.
good poster child for bringing the love of Jesus to people because they're going to say, well, you seem pretty miserable.
Sure.
So, but godliness when accompanied by contentment, and I think that's when we learn to accept whatever God's given to us. And lament comes in there because some of what comes is hurtful and
Yeah.
painful and we'd never choose it. But when I can be content, like the Apostle Paul, he said, I've learned to be content when I have a lot and when I have a little. So, he'd learned it. He'd learned the secret, and the secret was I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. So I'm still learning that secret.
Brooke here. In case you missed the exciting news from Elizabeth, this December, your generosity goes even further. From December 1st to 31st, all donations to Intentional will be matched dollar for dollar up to $250,000, thanks to a few generous partners. Visit intentionalparents.org today or click on the link in the show notes to double your impact. And while you're at it, become a legacy builder. All right, back to the show.
So much there. I love that you brought up that verse. That's a perfect segue into what we want to talk about next, which, I think it's one thing to hear all the scriptures you just read about grumbling and complaining and not doing it and being content. I love the last one you just quoted, though. I have learned to be content
Learned.
Yeah,
in all
that's
of these
Philippians.
circumstances because it is Christ who strengthens me. Because we all know and are definitely growing in our awareness that approaching things like this from a behavior modification standpoint, well, I just need to be content because God tells me that He has everything I need. That is what we now would call spiritual bypassing, where we're trying to just get over everything we feel by not actually going through it and just hyper spiritualizing it so that we don't have to actually feel it. And it just doesn't work. It might work for a week or two or three, and then we find ourselves right back in that cycle.
You're going to have a very fat fund of complaining
Exactly.
fines.
Your Phil's Funeral Fund. Yeah, if you have a
Exactly.
fund, please name it Phil's Funeral Fund.
You know what just hit me
Send them
though?
money.
I just looked up that verse and something hit me because this other verse had popped in my mind this morning as I was praying about this episode. So it is Philippians 4 where Paul says, "Not that I speak from want. I've learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means. I also know how to live in prosperity." So in other words, he knew how to. Because that messes a lot of people up
Yeah.
too when they have too much money and too much leisure and too much. I mean, America, we have too much free time. I mean,
Yes.
we have first world problems. We're not worried
true.
about whether or not we're going to have food for dinner.
Yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah.
But he says this here, but also in Corinthians, he had this an ailment. I think was an eye disease because he said, "I know you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me." We don't know exactly what was wrong with him, but he said 3 times I asked the Lord to take it away. So he's lamenting. So the guy
Yes.
that says I've learned also cried out to God to take something away from him.
Yeah, He's also accepted.
And God said no, because my grace is going to be made strong in you, and my your weakness is going to allow my power to. In other words, I'm going to do greater things in you and through you. Because of this weakness, you're going to have to depend upon me. And I think that's what he's talking about when he says, I've
Yeah.
learned. And so I think that here's an example of one of the greatest followers of Jesus
Yeah.
ever to live. I mean, penned much of the New Testament, and we talk about him all the time. And, he was martyred. I mean,
Yeah.
and yet he had to
He
learn.
didn't
just like
learn because
he had
all
to
things went well or because he just
No.
decided, I'm just not going to complain.
Right.
He had
Yeah,
really
no.
lived things that were worth complaining about.
And there were times he
Yes.
grieved and lamented. And so,
Okay, well, you're leading us straight there. So we just want to talk about what are some things that we can try to, we've said that grumbling is pretty much always a symptom of something else underneath. So what are some things we can be looking for, watching for, things we need to do? These are not like prescriptive, do these things and you won't grumble. But these come out of our own life and our own, I think we all have different reasons why we might be prone to grumbling or complaining in different areas, or even an intolerance to grumbling and complaining. I know sometimes that's how you feel, Brooke. It drives you absolutely crazy to hear people grumbling. But
Whoa. Hold up a second.
Okay,
maybe you say something. Here's what I have a problem with. Complaining about things that you can change really does bother me, because it's a choice to sit and grumble and complain, or it's a choice to deal with it.
yeah, you're more action oriented.
So I have a hard time when it's like, if you're talking about the weather, well, that's annoying on one level because you can't change that.
Exactly.
So that's frustrating. So complaining about it really doesn't do much good.
So I'd complain about him complaining about the weather. Definitely.
But she has such a great attitude. She said God made the world and he wanted it to rain a lot in Portland.
yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
true.
That's very
It's
true.
true.
So,
Yeah.
but to the point, it's not that I just dismiss and can't have complaining. It's that I have found in my life, no fruit comes from complaining. I don't think that I'm not motivated by complaining.
Right.
It doesn't help me usually. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have moments where I have to be honest about things being hard, but ongoing complaining as maybe like a default, that's something going on in your heart. I also think it's partly due to a different personality disposition. Because for example, I'm not sitting, you, Elizabeth, are able to look at the world and go, this is wrong with the world. That's wrong with that situation. That should probably be different. That should change. Well, I don't see the world that way,
Yeah.
which is both a blessing in some ways and maybe a curse in
Yeah.
others. You can see things I can't, but I'm not always seeing the things that could be better. A lot of the times I'm like, well, that's just what it is. So there's I think a personality disposition too in that. So it's not a better or worse or more godly thing for me, as much as it's like I just can't find yet it being a fruitful activity. It never leads to good in my life personally that I've found. So it doesn't mean I don't do it at times, but I was actually really thinking about this. I don't know if I'm an active complainer. I don't think I am, but I could be unaware of this. So in real time, you get to answer this question, but be nice.
No, I don't think you're an active complainer.
Your laugh was so
My laugh is because I think there's more behind the fact that it bothers you so much.
I knew it. You're psychoanalyzing me. I knew that. I knew you were going to be like, well, I think it's probably because of an area where you don't even
No,
know
I'm
about.
not. I actually can't. I can't tell you what it is.
I knew you were going to do that.
But okay, let's just
go
dive into
into it.
this.
Go
Let's
into it.
dive into
Yes.
the first one, because I think you're 100% right. Some personality types are more prone to
Sure.
complaining versus others who aren't.
Sure.
And what I've learned about myself very slowly over time, and I feel like this is even a new discovery as well, is that so often we're complaining because really what we need to be doing is lamenting and grieving with God.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's been a huge part of my story, and something even recently actually that you pointed out to me.
Give it to me, girl.
I've been
Come on.
complaining a lot
Preach to me what I preach to
lately.
you.
We are in yet again another really hard season with our kids, and it's a really rough patch with Birdie. And I have been feeling just overwhelmed by it, and it's been super hard. And it's been probably one of the most overwhelming as far as like just
Knowing what to
everything's
do.
moving so fast.
Yeah.
And I'm really tired of having hard seasons with our kids. I mean, that has been,
And it's not that maybe, yeah, you take a tear break to just maybe say, it's not that our kids are not great humans. It's that we just have a lot of physical health challenges, mental health challenges, that kind of stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
lot
this
of
is the
dynamics.
journey of having kids with special needs. It ebbs and it flows, and you get seasons that feel lighter, and then you have other seasons that are harder, and we're back into a hard one. And I'm tired of it. And I'm finding myself complaining a lot, needing to talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
And I can't even remember what the thing was. You know, those arguments where the thing is not the thing. He said something and I lost it. And we got into a big argument.
Sounds about right.
And we're trying to work it out. And I'm still like really upset, but we're like more rational. We're starting to work it out. And I just start crying. And I end up on the floor of my closet just bawling. This was a couple weeks ago.
Oh, I remember. I was there. I remember.
And he just looks at me and just says, I think you're grieving.
Yeah.
And I just it was like a duh moment of like, I hadn't even connected the fact that the reason I was complaining and having to talk constantly about how overwhelmed I am about things I can't change, they're not things I can fix right now, was actually that I was grieving a whole lot. I was grieving this stage. I was grieving what motherhood looked like. I was grieving what homeschool looks like, and the reality that at that point, I didn't think I could keep doing it. And I was grieving all of that. And I needed him to point out to me, to take a step back out of his annoyance of how hard I'd been to be around because I was complaining, and be able to speak that truth into what was actually happening. Yeah. And so I think, especially for me, so often what we complain about is stuff that we're not letting ourselves grieve with God.
Yes.
And when we read the scriptures, there's so much lament with God. Even God himself starts in the beginning of the biblical story in Genesis 6:6. It says the Lord regretted that he'd made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. Like he felt deeply troubled about his creation that he loved so much, that was broken and fallen and not what he designed it to be. God himself was deeply troubled. And we see all these moments in the scriptures that I think somehow we've missed or haven't been talked about enough, at least. Of obviously we know the book of Psalms and David and the way he just pours his heart out to God. In Psalm 6, he says, I'm worn out from my groaning. Like I've exhausted myself.
Yeah.
He talks about crying. He talks about feeling weak from his sorrow. And he's just honest with God. And then he says, the Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer.
Yeah.
Like it's okay to come to God like that.
But you're inviting him into your grief.
Yes, you're doing it with him. You're
and
not
the injustice of life gone bad.
Yes, it's not the people of Israel in Exodus groaning at God. Why did you make us leave here? Although sometimes I think we have to create space to say, God, I have these questions. I don't understand why this is my journey. And that's okay to talk to God with God. It's not talking about God in your own flesh. I can't stand that God is allowing this to happen. It's saying, God, I don't understand. I want to understand. I want to believe that you're good, but I'm struggling to believe that right now.
Yeah, that's not grumbling.
No.
That's the way, whatever you want to call it, complaining or just asking questions, and I'm hurting, and why. That was the Apostle Paul. Can you take this away from me? Psalm 119, I just finished it. It's that psalm with 9 million verses, and it takes forever to read. But look upon my affliction and rescue me. These cries are all over the Psalms, where I'm hurting. I don't know what to do. Rescue me. I'm confused. Trouble and anguish have come upon me. But your commandments are my delight. And so I think that that's what you're talking about. And I think that too often, I'll speak for myself, Diane does this all the time. Lord, what's this about? And then she also is one that's just pretty much content wherever God's put her. She's such a great example to me of that. So she's not a complainer. Both of us had parents that said, quit whining or I'll give you something to whine about. That was our parents' generation. That's what we all heard. But she's not a whiner.
But I would wonder, Mom,
externally.
But Mom, I would wonder if part of the reason, though, is that you have a very, very consistent practice of, as you begin to feel things, to feel off in your spirit, to bring that question to God. God, what is this about? So I would wonder.
And he never fails. I feel clueless about myself.
Yeah.
but he never fails to lead me within a short period of time to understanding,
Yeah.
so that's what this is really
I would
about.
wonder if you did not have that practice and you didn't do that regularly,
Well,
if there would be more internal or external.
And I didn't even really fully understand this until I think it's a process, because we were not taught. We were taught no grumbling and complaining, kind of solid. And I think we did that to you kids.
Yeah.
Kind of a zero tolerance policy.
It didn't work.
Yes, you taught that.
Sins of the father.
Yeah. Yes, you taught that, and no, it did not stick.
I know John, Mark, Rebecca,
modification.
and Elizabeth, at least. Matthew, I don't know yet. His jury's out.
Well,
No, Rebecca doesn't complain.
That's
I
true,
actually
that's
really,
true.
she
when
doesn't
she
complain.
moved to Portland, we moved to Portland. She was only 7, so she had a lot of discipling by her father.
Okay, but I want to insert something
Yes.
for parents here, for Christian parents specifically, because I think I squelched complaints when maybe it was more nuanced than I understood. And most of us raising kids in the 80s and 90s understood. And I was in a conversation over email with a new friend who has suffered bilateral hearing loss like me. And so she was talking, but she's in the process of raising kids, so she's not done yet. So I told her one of my real regrets is that I hadn't included my kids more in that story. I was trying to protect them from my great fear. I started losing my hearing at 26. I was functionally deaf by 30, which means it was very hard for me to hear, even with hearing aids. But I tried to protect my kids, and the opposite kind of happened. When I wrote my book, John Mark talked about how much fear he remembers from that time, because we weren't talking about it. I was hiding it. And she was talking, and so I was telling this new friend what Elizabeth has taught me about this practice of lament. In all my years, it's only been the last probably 10 that, at the most, that you've been teaching me about lament. And realizing, it's so powerful and so beautiful. I wish that I taught my kids to lament. I wish they brought them into my own lament and my own grief. Instead, I tried to kind of hide it. And she said one sentence really interesting for all of us who very self-righteously tell our kids not to complain. I was very much raised in a home in which the acknowledgement of sadness was thought to be little more than a veiled complaint, and complaints were simply not tolerated. And I thought, oh gosh, my daughter was raised in the same kind of home. And I think we can do better. I don't say that with any sort of shame, but I love, and this should encourage parents too, that it's my kids who are teaching me at a greater level of how God wants to be involved in every emotional aspect of our life. There's no bad emotions. He wants us to do it with him.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're all talking about. So we don't want to just stomp on complaints from our kids, or we want to help guide them into lamenting. And we want to be beside them when they're lamenting.
Doing it with him. That's so good. You know, our friend Amy Carmichael.
Oh, yes, you hear us quote her
Diane's
all
the
the
one
time.
that's got me reading this book by Amy, who's been with the Lord a long time.
A long time.
So this is how, Brooke, you were saying in the other day that we can be mentored by books and by people gone before.
She's mentoring.
Amy
both.
Carmichael was a missionary in India, and she has, after she was gone, this gal that gave her life to helping her took a bunch of her devotionals, would have been devotionals for
her team,
for the team that was mothering all these orphans, and she said she's talking about doing this with God. So she says, "He who says, 'Come unto me,' that's Jesus, does not push us away when we come. Who, the Holy Spirit so kindly helps our infirmities." That's Romans 8, where it says the Spirit intercedes for us in times of weakness. She said the Holy Spirit then kindly helps our infirmities. And she says, and we feel discouraged, tell him so. And so that's what you have learned to do, and what I wasn't doing as much. There's complaining, just whining about stuff. It's totally different to talk to God about it. So,
but here's the interesting thing: he he was complained for 30 years that we lived in Portland about the rain on an almost daily basis. But then he had major knee surgery, knee replacement, whole knee replacement. It's a brutal surgery.
know.
I mean, they
Basketball,
literally take,
basketball injury, but yeah.
They literally take a surgical chainsaw and go through. I mean, I had no idea how gruesome it was. He never complained once.
That's so
And I
bizarre.
thought, okay,
I didn't know that.
So the rain, but I mean, he was in pain. He couldn't move it, couldn't even wheel the bike one time in the first time of physical therapy.
Oh, wow.
Couldn't get that thing around. And he stuck with it, and he went to everything, and he approached it like an athlete. You know, I'm going to conquer this, without one time even saying, I had to ask him, are you in pain? Not really, not bad.
What? What's going on?
So I don't know what that is about.
Well, I think that's interesting. I was going to say, though, I think the art of figuring out, what is the deeper thing is important. So I'll just, to anyone that might be like, what do I even do? Where do I start? How do I even figure out what's maybe below the surface? I know for me, I haven't always been in touch actively with certain parts of that are going on. Like I'll feel a lot and I'll know I'm feeling a lot, but I won't even necessarily go, oh, it's obviously because this happened and this happened and this happened. So I remember in different times of my life, and I still use this practice, but certain times it's better to use or more helpful to use. But just the process of sitting down and asking yourself a couple questions. What am I happy about? What am I sad about? What am I angry about? What am I thankful for? What am I looking forward to? Asking yourself these questions and then being honest about what those things are help you, I think, start to identify or make a clearer picture of what might be going on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And those questions are super helpful, I think, on the regular of the moments, like Elizabeth was even saying, like in these moments that are just seasons maybe that are really hard. That's a really helpful, just very tangible practice that opens up my mind to what was going on. And honestly, what was so bizarre is anytime I would feel a lot but not know, just going through that practice, by the time I was done doing that, I felt very different internally, which was interesting. That was just, and I don't have all the psychology behind it, but just even naming it and helping me see what was actually going on just gave psychological relief, which definitely helped in the arena of complaining. So,
well, and I think sometimes that's all it takes. I mean, back to the me crying on the floor of my closet a few weeks ago, because this is now a regular practice in my life or a topic in my life I'm not afraid of anymore. Lamenting grief. I've learned so much about how when you're willing to face the difficult feeling about it, you actually move through it much faster than when you're trying to spend all your energy avoiding, subconsciously or consciously. But to your point, after you pointing that out, and I knew, okay, I know what tomorrow's going to be. I know I'm going to feel very sad, probably somewhat buried in grief, and I have to go through that. I have to let myself feel what I'm feeling about this season. And got up in the morning and processed all of that grief in my journal with God, wrote out everything I'm sad about, mad about,
why are you
grieving.
When you said that? Mad about, obviously.
No, not you. It wasn't you, actually. I don't think you made the page, so well done.
I read your journal. I'm just kidding. I don't.
Gosh.
I don't. I would not want to know.
But I felt so much freedom after that. And so to your point of sometimes that's all it takes is to slow down enough and say, what am I sad about? What am I mad about? What am I happy about? What am I thankful for? Because the more positive emotions, whatever you want to call them, to take a minute to say, what am I glad about? What am I thankful for? What am I looking forward to? That pulls you up in a really good way. That's not a reframing of, well, I'm just going to choose to be happy because Jesus died for me. And so I'm going to ignore all these other things. But it's a truthful moment to recognize, yes, there might be these things I'm sad about, mad about, angry about, but there's also the joy and sorrow in the same breath. That there's also things that I'm glad about, happy about, looking forward to, thankful for. So I love that.
But the key thing is you're doing it with God.
Yes.
Which is what your mom does every morning, with God. She's journaling about her feelings and what you're doing. I think that's a beautiful thing. So I don't know if you're going to quote, you were going to quote Matthew 12:34, I think it is, the words of Jesus, for the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. So what I should have done is when I found myself complaining, I should have done a deeper dive. What you were saying yesterday, like you said something to me
It's
yesterday.
so
that
beautiful.
I didn't blow you off because I've learned you're kind of the prophetess of the family. So I said, no, I don't think that's what was going on. But then I said, but I'm going to think about it because so you said maybe the reason I missed the Bay Area because is that you had all these just flood of goodness and great memories and I did. You know, I had the
was a
greatest
beautiful season of
childhood.
your
I
life.
got to play in a band for 9 years. I got saved there. I got
You
baptized there.
got married there?
Got married there.
Here's
Met
your
Diane
first
there.
3
Had
kids?
all 4 of our kids in the same hospital in Good Samaritan Hospital in San Jose. I had, I got to serve the Lord there in one of the, first mega churches. I had all these people come to Christ. I met Louise. All this stuff all happened there. First date at Mount Hermon, and you saying maybe it's not just the weather. Maybe it's like
What it represents.
what happened there in your
Separating
life.
from what
And
was a thin place
I have
for
to
you, a
really
holy
think
place.
hard to get to bad memories. It's like,
Yeah.
and so I thought, maybe there's something there. So I actually meditated on
Good
that a little bit
job.
this morning.
Good
Thanks
job,
to you,
Dad.
Elizabeth. And I thought, you know what? I think there's some truth in what my daughter told me.
Yeah.
But again, that's perspective.
Yeah.
That's gratitude. That's being thankful for. You can have had something, doesn't mean you always have to have it.
True.
You're going to complain forever because you don't have it now. Because honestly, I was led to Portland and I got to experience a move of God. What if I said, well, I'm not going to go there? God is so gracious. He could have said, great, I can use somebody else who will go there. But he didn't. He's so gracious to work with us and help us through even our grumbling, complaining. He's not the kind of father that says, well, that was the 8th time, you're done. He's so gracious, and we got to experience some,
Amazing
life-changing things in Portland too.
So the next thing, do we get to the first one yet?
Yeah, that was the first
That
one.
was the first one. That's what I thought. So the second one is acceptance. Let's talk about acceptance.
Yeah.
And the second and third one we'll move through, but part of it is also acceptance. Am I leading this conversation? Or are you?
No, I
thought
think
you were leading the
Elizabeth is.
conversation.
I was going to say you should lead the acceptance part because you've got a lot of great things to
real
say on that.
briefly, in like a couple of sentences, can you explain, because it took me so long to figure it out because it was new vocabulary to me. I understand it now. The difference between grieving and lament.
Yeah. I mean, the way I understand it and connects with me the most, and just in learning about it and researching it, grief is the emotion that we feel about something that has happened, about a loss, and I think so often we attach words like grief, like think that they can only be attached to really big catastrophic losses. And we often define loss as somebody died.
Yeah.
Or we lost a child, but we really need to broaden it out because we live in a fallen world, which means every human on the planet faces grief on a daily basis because we live in a world we weren't created for.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's the emotion we feel about the loss, the hard thing, the disappointment. That's another huge one. But lament is a passionate expression of that grief to God. Yeah. It's something we do with God. It's not just staying in the I'm overcome with how I feel about how hard this is or how disappointed I am.
You get stuck, right?
Yes. And a lot of people are afraid because that's overwhelming. Yeah. When that wave comes, and it can be very scary, especially if you've never let yourself go there before. And there are times when that happens. And that, I think, as believers, is a signal to say, whoa, I need to talk to God about this. I need to bring all of this awfulness to God. And it's not a cleaned up, shined up, I come to him when I've got it under control and I just tell him, it's really hard right now. Will you give me strength? No, this is so hard. I think I might die. I don't feel like I can do this. Yeah. I don't understand. Yeah. I've talked to multiple women lately who had stillborn children, and I can't even fathom. I can't even fathom that. I mean, I think I can fathom it actually because I'm a mother. And just the wrestling that they have to do and will have to do for the rest of their life, trying to understand that with God. Yeah. You never stop grieving and lamenting
and
that.
Maybe you're understanding, I still love the title of the book that says, it's not supposed to be that way.
Yes, Lisa
because
Turkers.
Since Genesis 3, life is not the way it's supposed to be.
No.
And I think in lamenting, you also get the Father's arms wrapped around you, grieving with you. Die. It's not supposed to be this way.
No.
You know.
And if you think, I mean, God himself experienced all of the losses that we do. The things, I remember when our son was really sick, I felt like I understood the significance of Jesus' death on the cross in a way that I never had before. I think anybody who's lost a child would be able to say the same, of recognizing God knows the grief of watching his children suffer.
Yes.
Like God is intimately acquainted with that grief. And so therefore, he can be intimately with me in my suffering because he himself has experienced the same thing that I'm experiencing. And so that's what lamenting is. It's recognizing God is grieving with you too.
Yes.
He's not sitting there saying, well, everything happens for a reason and I won't give you more than you can handle. All the things people say that are not in the Bible.
Or are in the Bible and are misquoted.
Entirely. That's a whole nother podcast.
So let's move on though. That was beautiful. I think you did a great job discerning between. But let's talk about acceptance. Part of that is, and remind me of the framework on this, for acceptance of the situation that you're in.
Yeah, I mean,
that's what we talked about.
Through oftentimes complaining is a symptom of the reality that I haven't actually accepted what's happening in my life.
Yeah.
Where God has me, the job he's given me, the family or the kids he's given me. I mean, how often do us parents get stuck complaining about our kids or our family life, myself included, when we have not accepted that these are the kids God gave me. This is the spouse I have. And this is like, I'm not looking at you over.
I don't feel that way about you. Interesting.
I don't. I'm using examples
I'm learning so much today through this episode. Wow. I didn't realize this is an intervention, a live intervention. I want to say though about acceptance, that is a huge piece, and we'll quickly move to the third one. I know, Diane, in a second, I'd love to hear that quote from Jacques Philippe. But I do want to say that I think acceptance is massive. And I'll just say personally, in my journey of life with Jesus and with really hard things that have happened, that has been probably one of the biggest gifts, is getting to the spot where you can look at everything that is not right and good and normal and say, this is reality for me right now. And that first initial awareness is hard, but there is a beauty in sitting in it and accepting it. And accepting doesn't mean you're like, now I'm okay with it fully. It means that you're moving towards the awareness that this is your actual life and you're not running from it. And that's a really important posture. Your disposition changes in subtle ways even when you start to accept. And there's a beauty there. But what's that quote, Diane, from Jacques Philippe?
I think acceptance is not something we can really do. We can just will into existence.
Yes.
I think it is a process. And it's a process that's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So you need to be patient with yourself. That's what I think in the long suffering of God towards us and his compassion is that it takes a while. It takes living into the reality of your now life. It takes a while to get to that point of acceptance. You know, I do remember with the loss of my hearing, there was a point where I had to stop fighting it because every 6 months I went back to the audiologist at first. And every 6 months I knew it was coming because I could tell in my daily life, but it'd be massive more hearing loss. And at some point I had to stop fighting it and accept, okay, I have this hearing now, but I'm not going to have, 3-5 years from now. What do I need to do? But I think that takes sometimes years, and sometimes you still have to go back to the grief and lament and the honesty. Oh my gosh, this is still hard.
Yeah.
But I love this. There's this. What would you call him? A monk?
Sure.
Jean Philippe.
Yeah, let's call him that.
Yeah. He is a French monk. Member of the community of the Beatitudes, which what a great community to be a part of. And he leads retreats, especially in Europe. And he really speaks a lot about freedom. And this is a little booklet he wrote, Interior Freedom. John Mark gave it to me for Christmas last year. And I've underlined most. Look at this.
Oh, I have it, but I need to read it.
Book.
I've only started it.
it's because he's French and it's translated and he's Catholic, so Catholicism has its own vocabulary. Sometimes he says things differently than we would probably say it. But he's talking about freedom, about interior freedom, like the freedom to embrace the life that we have and flourish in it. And he talks about acceptance as consenting. So it's active, it's not passive. Acceptance is not just, I give in. It's just going to happen. Life's bad, life's hard. It's actually us coming to the point where we consent to what we did not originally choose. That brings it down to kind of a control issue, which I think there's not an American alive who doesn't have control issues. I certainly do. But actually getting to the point where you now in this stage of life with Birdie going through any transitions seem to be really rough on kids with neurodiversity and then therefore the whole family, right? But you getting to the point where you didn't choose this and consenting once again to what you would never choose if it was up to you. And I think there's just something really beautiful about it. He says, the highest and most fruitful form of human freedom, interior freedom, is in accepting even more than in dominating. In order to become truly free, we are often called to choose to accept what we did not want. We must train ourselves to accept peacefully and willingly plenty of things that seem to contradict our freedom. This means consenting even to our personal limitations and our personal weaknesses. Those are the situations that really make us grow, are precisely those we do not control.
Yes.
So I don't know, something about the way he puts things.
I think where he probably got that was from Saint Teresa of Lisieux.
Oh, I think
and she
he does.
said, her quote is, "I decided to choose what I have not chosen."
Oh, I think he actually quotes her in here.
Yeah,
yes.
sure. I've decided to choose what I have not chosen. That idea of acceptance that we're actively, is it right there? Yeah.
It's active, not passive.
It's active. Because that language, even when I was hearing, I was like, that sounds just like Saint Teresa of Lisieux. But the point being is that same idea that you are choosing to accept the stuff that you would rather not have chosen, the stuff you wouldn't have picked up. I remember when we were interviewing Megan Fate Marshman, I think we were talking about this, and this actually really—
You said that quote.
I said that quote, but it really threw her off at first because she's also a really unique story. Her husband died tragically and suddenly, and all of a sudden, young, and not too many years ago. And obviously, it's so interesting. That's going to hit different depending upon what tragedy or pain or suffering you're in. And so we can say that really quick, but that might mean a lot for some of you. Maybe in that example of even what we were just saying about Megan Fate Marshman is choosing to accept or choosing to be in what you haven't picked out for yourself is a very hard thing that you need to do with the Spirit.
The word embrace comes to mind. It's not just a passive, well, I guess I'll just accept, but no, this is my life. This is what's happening. So I'm going to reorient. And
way before Saint Teresa and before Philippe was Job.
You win. You win.
I got to go to the Bible. No. Job's a fascinating story because then he starts, becoming self-righteous and he starts questioning God. It's beautiful because—
But it's even hopeful, isn't it?
It's hopeful because he starts off so strong.
Yep.
He didn't choose. He loved his family. He prayed for them on their birthdays and everything. All of a sudden, they're all taken away from him. And he says, the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He worships. He fell to the ground and worshiped, and he didn't sin or blame God. Okay, so it starts there. And then, the next chapter, his wife says, why don't you just curse God and die? So she was not helpful, right? But what he said to her, the next verse, he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept, here's the word, we're talking about acceptance. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So I think there's a biblical example of acceptance, but then the beautiful thing is then he starts defending himself and whining and questioning. So like you're saying, it's sometimes it takes a long time. And in the end, he finally says, he realizes, I don't know, I believe in God, but now I see him. And he finally just falls down, and I can't figure all this out.
Like, I don't know, but I don't know.
He actually falls down in total acceptance at the end. And then God, so God refines him through the whole thing. But I mean, I just think here it's beautiful at this point. He said, I've accepted good and I'm going to accept adversity. So I think that's what we want to work towards, is to be able to be those people that, because the early believers, you were going to talk about this. Is that our next point?
Yeah, so let's do this. Third point, I think you need to notice expectations about what life is supposed to be like. Like sometimes we have an expectation that life is supposed to be a very certain type of way. That's idealism. But yeah, we were talking about the idea that of entitlement, that the early church expected to suffer.
Yeah,
you said that, Diane,
well, we've all been reading some of Jerry Sitzer's books.
Oh, yeah.
Which he somehow is able to make church history just come alive to us.
Because he suffered.
As he suffered greatly. But he brings church history in particular alive, especially by using biographical stories of people who've gone before us. So if any of you like stories and history and want to kind of understand our faith, our ancient faith, pick up any of Jerry Sitzer's book, Water from a Deep Well, and what's the one he wrote before that? It's particularly good.
I don't know, but we're going to find out.
Something church.
No, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We'll link them in. We'll put them in the show notes. But can I add, even if you're not particularly interested in that stuff, it will make you interested.
Yes, absolutely.
And he does a masterful job of helping you understand how we got to where we are now.
Yes.
Which, after hearing him speak a lot on that, it's really opened my eyes to the importance of us understanding what led us to our cultural moment.
And staying connected theologically.
Yes.
So, if nobody believed that for the last 2,000 years, then maybe we're egotistical to think that we can come up with a whole new hermeneutic or way of seeing things. But what really strikes me when I read his books is how the early church expected to suffer. Because Jesus hadn't said that very thing to his disciples.
He did.
They hated me, they'll hate you too. And their expectation was martyrdom was an honor only for very courageous people who did not give in to Rome. And there was just general acceptance that they would be flourishing according to the Beatitudes, according to the Sermon on the Mount, but their actual life would be taking up their cross to follow Christ, and that would hurt. What a different way, though, that they were able to live life because of that expectation. And somehow we've gotten into our pop theology, and I've been the worst of these at times, of thinking that if we follow Jesus, life is just going to go great. Everything's going to work together for our good. And our good means I want this perfect little fantasy of a Hallmark movie life.
There's a lot of Hallmark movies coming out right now this time of year, too.
Yes.
I love Hallmark
you know
Christmas
what?
movies.
It's dangerous thinking because none of us escape.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. And, you lay the prosperity gospel. Hey, follow Jesus, healthy, wealthy, and happy. Yeah. Lay that against the early church, and it doesn't jive. Right. I mean, the Apostle Peter, tradition says he was crucified upside down. He said, I'm not worthy to be crucified as my Lord was crucified. Crucify me upside down. I mean, you think about that compared to how we think, when you were talking about this, the book of Hebrews, I just finished Hebrews, I'm in 1 Peter, but, this is written to a suffering church. And in chapter 10, the author, we don't know who the author is, says, remember the former days when, after being enlightened, after coming to know Christ, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, plural, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. You showed sympathy to the prisoners, accepted joyfully the seizure of your property. And here's why. Knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and an abiding one. In other words, you have God, you have eternal life, you have life with the Father. You know that this life is not all there is. Their perspective was so different than the here and now.
Yeah.
And they they were counted themselves worthy to suffer for the gospel.
Right.
And like in a prosperous America where we don't have to worry about our next meal, and we're surrounded by this false gospel of
but that's
leisure,
why,
pleasure, and treasure, as Garrett Jones calls
I was
it. You know,
gonna say.
with his cool
Jones.
British accent.
Leisure, pleasure, and treasure.
Leisure, pleasure, and treasure.
Yeah.
But it's easy to forget this, isn't it?
It is. Well, and that's where I think even today, as we wrap up, it's important to say that we all have different reasons why we complain. But I think that's why we are asking these questions. Like, is it lamenting or grieving? Do you need to accept, or do you have a level of entitlement? Like, I'm just surprised that life is even hard. And wherever you're at and whatever the source is, I think even today, our hope is that you have a fuller understanding of what actually has been going on with you, or maybe even a process to start. Hopefully you can use some of the stuff that we talked about today to start the process of discovering, and maybe some of you will be lamenting, as Elizabeth talked about, with God. You're going to be doing that with God, or grieving and feeling those emotions, accepting what is, or maybe just being rid of entitlement.
Or maybe accepting, maybe repenting.
Yeah. Oh,
of
yes.
entitlement.
That's a great
me.
Yes,
whatever it
repenting
might
as well.
be.
Yeah, because there's a
Let's do
part
it.
there that can be really unhealthy. So.
And Brooke, you were just on our break looking at the weather app saying that there is a possible winter storm coming here. It's going to be very cold and very
I'm
sweany.
so
So
excited.
Phil,
I
in a
didn't know
couple of
about this.
days, we're
We're going to see if Phil's funeral fund gets a contribution.
His first contribution.
We'll put, if you listen to the episode we recorded before, I don't know when they're coming out, but before this one, Birdie will hold you very accountable if you let her in to you're not allowed to
I'll let her
complain.
in. I'd love to.
Oh, yeah.
You told me I'd only last one winter here, then I would get the proper coat. But I still
Have you
haven't.
done it? Oh
No.
my
You
gosh.
get the right coat, man.
I need to listen to my daughter.
All right. Thank you for listening today.